Welcome to the SJX Podcast. Today's conversation begins with one of the most fascinating auction stories of the season, the sale of Francis Ford Coppola's personal FFC. This is the actual prototype of the FP Journe FFC, the watch born from a conversation in the Napa Valley between Coppola and François-Paul Journe back in 2012. And now it's coming to market at Phillips in December with an estimate in excess of $1 million. We'll also look at the highlight from the spring season with the Breguet Sympathique #1, which was won by FP Journe himself to star in his upcoming museum. But let's start with Phillips this upcoming December. SJX, were you surprised to see Coppola's watch surface so soon?
Initially, I was, but upon reflection, it makes sense. I mean, it's been widely reported he spent more than $100 million on the movie Megalopolis, which I haven't seen, but for which the reviews are terrible. And apparently, he spent like $100 million of his own money, mind you. It wasn't financed by anyone else. He sold his vineyard. He sold God knows what else to finance this. And it grossed like, I don't know, $15-16 million. I mean, even if he was a billionaire, I mean, that's a huge hole. So I don't blame him for selling the watch. And I think François-Paul Journe probably also understands that Francis Ford Coppola is an artist. He's an artist who spent $100 million on a work of art that nobody wants to buy. So I think François-Paul understands why he's selling the watch.
Yeah, his public remarks, are supportive too, because I think he sees it as a way for Coppola to be able to make his next, great work of art. And I think that there's a kinship there between these two individuals. And, it's certainly unfortunate that Coppola is in this situation. But, it sounds like he's kind of had some booms and busts throughout his career. But that's just a reflection of his personal ambition. And I think his vision to try to create something. I guess I was one of just a few people to see Megalopolis. I wish I could sit here and say it was a work of genius, and it probably is. It just was a little bit over my head. I wanted to like it. It just wasn't my favorite movie. Wasn't my favorite Coppola movie. But I'm happy that I saw it. I'm happy to be some of the 14 million that he did make from the movie. But this watch is so interesting. I mean, it's the only watch that, Journe doesn't personally take credit for designing, which I think is interesting. It kind of, that kind of draws a line around it in the history and in the pantheon of FP Journe watches and designs. So I think that's interesting. And then the other thing is, like, not only was this the first one, this is one of two prototypes that was made, assembled by Journe himself, which is, he usually does one prototype, I believe, and the firm retains that permanently to be, in their future museum. Very, very smart. Not all brands do that. Every brand should. Journe has a super long-term view, and that is reflected in his products and in his practice of doing this. This time there were two prototypes, and he sold one. This is only one of like 6 prototypes that the company has ever officially sold to a private client. So just a lot of interesting dynamics around this. It's got the blackened hand as opposed to kind of the more natural gray or blued hand of the piece unique for Only Watch. But I mean, this is literally a blockbuster lot coming to Phillips. And I mean, the auction, the estimate, in excess of $1 million sounds extremely conservative to me.
Yeah. I mean, if I had $5 million, I would buy it. I think it's an important watch and it's very cool. And I think it will sell for at least $4-5 million all in.
Yeah, I think I mean, in apples to apples, I think it should exceed the Only Watch edition, which was 4.5 million francs, I believe, at a time when the currency values were a little bit different. Yeah. But nonetheless, it will be an exciting room to be in.
Yeah, exactly. And what you mentioned earlier about Journe keeping the prototypes and so on, that underscores his vision, long-term vision. I think this brings us to the point of the Breguet Sympathique clock #1 that he paid a record price for. Just one auction season ago in May 2025, he paid almost just, I think, shy $100,000 less than the Duke d'Orleans Sympathique clock that's now in the Patek Philippe Museum, which is people regard as the greatest original Breguet Sympathique. And the clock he made is cost almost the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this sort of underlines his vision of himself as a figure in the history of watchmaking with his museum. His museum were, of course, all the prototypes, as you mentioned, the prototype watches he made in the past that he has retained, but also other important watches, clocks like this, which he produced. And I think the interesting thing, which you will see in the article we just published about the clock, is that from the very beginning, he had a vision of his brand and where he would be. I'm guessing that probably some people at the time thought he was delusional, but now, 30 years later, he's got there. Because when you speak to him, you realize from the very beginning he was planning or trying to be something like Breguet. And initially, the plan was to buy a brand like Breguet or Leroy or one of these old brands, resurrect it, and sort of to inherit the mantle. But for various reasons, all of it didn't pan out. He didn't manage to resurrect another brand, and he struck out on his own, which was, in hindsight, the right decision. And also, when you speak to him, you realize that he had this ambition of doing that, and that's how he came to the Sympathique clock. I mean, back then, if to understand, he was only like 20-something-year-old, 30-year-old watchmaker, and he wanted to rebuild the Sympathique, which hadn't been done in like 200 years. And then he still has all the archive documents from the construction of the Sympathique. And looking at these documents, you realize like it was really a different time. Like he showed me a fax, mind you, a fax of a sketch of the Sympathique case that was done by David Penny, the English watch illustrator who's still around actually. And actually the fax, because I guess today nobody would know, but when you send a fax, you can see who it came from. It's printed at the top. And the fax didn't come from David Penny. So I asked François-Paul, why didn't it come from him? He says probably David Penny didn't even own a fax machine at the time. So, this was really a different time. And all the documents show how he put it together, how he hired other people to join THA that eventually built the series production of the clock. And the interesting thing, it's clear he was behind it because he also knows the weaknesses of the Sympathique. As he says, this was built at a different time. It was constructed when he was much younger. And if he did it today, he would do a lot of things differently to make it a better clock.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine how much he has, he's forgotten more than most watchmakers will learn in a lifetime. I can only imagine what he's learned through making the Resonance, the Grand Sonnerie, and on down the line that he would retroactively apply to it. Now, just to your point about kind of his view of where he always wanted to end up, kind of in the history of watchmaking. To your point, when he was younger, people probably thought he was crazy, but so many of his actions really reinforce the reality of achieving that. I think one of the things that he did that was interesting was when there was the name Sabrier, the Sabrier Library.
Jean-Claude Sabrier.
Yes. Wow. This was a vast collection of watch books that was coming to auction, and it was going to be split up and go every which way, but he decided to buy the entire lot, keep it together. It's now in the lobby of the manufacturer in Geneva. And that actions like that, I think, speak so loudly. Buying the Janvier resonance clock way back early in the brand's history, when that would have been an absolutely extraordinary purchase. That was in the millions 20 years ago when he bought that clock. And so these regular actions really reinforce this. And I mean, regardless of whether or not somebody likes the watches, I think it's his position in kind of this hierarchy is becoming increasingly established.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Jean-Claude Sabrier library. I think that also underscores that François-Paul is actually quite a sentimental guy, because Sabrier was one of his good friends. He was part of a circle of, I guess, watch people in Geneva and Paris at the time in the 80s and 90s, and they were good friends. And he bought it also because Sabrier was his friend. And I think that, despite what people might say or think of him, he's actually a fairly sentimental guy.
Yeah.
But also on the point of the anti-Janvier clock, I think, he spent recently, he spent like this $6 million on the Breguet Sympathique #1. He could have spent $6 million on so many other things. I think a lesser man would have spent his $6 million going on holiday, buying a Bugatti or a Koenigsegg and enjoying life. But François-Paul Journe has become successful. Now he has made a lot of money, and he spends all the money buying even more watches and clocks rather than anything else, which I think really, really shows that he's all in 100% in what he's doing, and he isn't doing anything else. I think this is something that sets him and other great artisans apart, is that they are really all in. You could give them $100 million and they'll put all of that back into what they do rather than doing anything else. I think this this is actually quite an important point. And I think this is what you'll see in his museum, which will open next year, which will not only have his own watches, but all of the timepieces made by other brands that he considers important. And I think his knowledge of watchmaking and timekeeping is so all-encompassing that there will be surprising watches in the museum that most people would never think, oh, François-Paul Journe owns this. As an example, he was a bidder on the Cartier Portico mystery clock last season at Phillips. And that's also a multi-million-dollar clock. He didn't win it, but, he was bidding into the millions. And I asked him why, and he says this will make a nice display in the museum with the Sympathique by F.P. Journe and the Cartier Portico, which he regards as an important clock in the 20th century watchmaking. So I think this kind of broad, diverse, and in-depth knowledge of watchmaking will make the F.P. Journe Museum one of the most interesting in Geneva. So that and the Patek Philippe Museum, I think, will make Geneva like a real place to visit if you want to look at historical clocks and watches.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think one of the cool things about the Patek Museum is like you said, they have the Duc d'Orléans Sympathique clock. They have a floor dedicated to non-Patek stuff all the way up to the year that Patek was founded. So it's like everything that everybody did before, all the best of everything, and then we've got it from here, 1839 and forward. But maybe I can convince F.P. Journe to buy the Brandon Moore Horological Library in that cabinet back there someday. There are actually several in common with the Sabrier Library that I noticed when I was there last time, but I don't think they have the G-Shock book that I have. So that'll be a new edition.
Okay, cool. I think that wraps up this episode. Stay tuned for the next one.